important to have a plan and understand what your goals are.
In fact, my camel out there is suffering right now with a broken back.
So I actually found Pepe when it was only a couple of hours old, and I'm like, oh, this is a funny meme.
Oh my god.
Yo! Who is this DJ?
The old man is swing trading over years at a time. And it's like, that's where the real money is made.
The answer is a permanent loss. With single-sided staking, you don't have to worry about impermanent loss.
If you're aware, if you're disciplined, you can hone that into further financial growth.
Financial freedom, to where you can actually live life and not have to be constantly living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, more or less, right?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am here with you on a lovely Friday night for a very special episode of Book Club. We have a special guest with us. I'm going to try to do his intro the best I can. So we have a possessor of a master's, a very fine bachelor, and an aspiring benevolent warlord that we can all aspire after. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Christian Heiens. Welcome to the show, my man. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I think the only thing I missed on that one was a political prognosticator.
Yeah, that's the one that my good friend Nick has always introduced me as on his show.
Absolutely. So, for the folks at home, in case you couldn't tell by the title, tonight we are covering The Law by Frederic Bastiat. This guy is a French philosopher from the 1850s talking about some libertarian values, and the inspiration for adding this to the book club list is actually with me on the show tonight. So, I'm super excited to cover this with you.
Well, Zenith, Bastiat is probably, first off, if you've never heard of him, and obviously you have, but if you've never heard of him, Bastiat is probably top 5 most important libertarian philosophers who've ever written any words. He existed during a time period where there was a lot of political upheaval in France. You started to get a lot of new ideas popping up. He was a contemporary of Marx, actually, even though he was living in Britain at the time. And Bastiat kind of noticed that there was a change in the political discourse when he was entering politics in his 40s. And he started jotting down a lot of, texts. He started writing a lot of essays, and a lot of the stuff that he was warning about at this point, over 150 years ago, in some ways is more relevant today than it was when he was writing. So it's very rare that you get somebody whose words are, almost eternal, so to speak. But Bastiat's definitely one of those guys.
That's true. I think in the preface of the book, it actually the person doing the audiobook talks about how books really become important when they last over 100 years. And, well, definitely got over 100 years on this one. Cool. Yeah. So, plan for the show tonight for the folks at home. We are going to be providing a little bit of context for both our guest and the author of the book. Then we're going to go through the actual arguments made by Bastiat. Then after that, we're going to start extrapolating it to some outside stuff, whether it's American philosophy and then also current day American politics. And then after that, at the end of the show, we should hopefully have a good foundation of where people can understand where the libertarian arguments come from and actually be able to argue from a principled standpoint. I know at the end of the day, it's very easy to sit at home and complain about all the different federal agencies and how Gary Gensler at the SEC is screwing up all of the markets. But at the same time, you got to understand that you're arguing from principles and not just against whatever the current thing is, even if it actually is not good. So that is the game plan for tonight. Alrighty, with that being said, Christian, I do have a small special thing to show you. When I told the folks that I work with what I was doing tonight, they actually made a meme for me. Mrs. Producer, if you can pull that up real quick. Zenith hosting a stream to complain about the historical French. My God, it's perfect. The dunking on the French, the tasteful contempt for socialism.
Here. Oh my gosh. It's kind of crazy that Bastiat, probably, again, one of the most important libertarian philosophers of all time, comes out of a country that today we associate with like just some of the most incompetent central planning you can possibly imagine.
Yeah. It's, in my personal opinion, I'm not a huge historian guy like yourself, unfortunately, but my view of the French kind of shifts as the time goes, where I was talking to my buddy, it's like back in the Revolutionary War, let's be honest, the French did kind of help carry the team a little bit, especially with just going and messing up the Brits. But then after that, they very quickly kind of became a bit of a laughing stock, unfortunately. And that's where we get to the modern day interpretation of our relationship with that country over there. So we think that for the women, the champagne, not much else. Alrighty, with that being said, before we get into the show proper, I do want to do what we always do here and shout out our people that are tuning in live. So, Mrs. Producer, if you don't mind, let's see who we have in the chats tonight. We have one of our very own, Will Stevenson, a typical book club member, but we're trying something a little bit different tonight, so glad to see you still in the chat. Hopefully you can share some of your thoughts on the book with us as well. Will actually covered Anatomy of the State last week on Book Club. He is also my co-host of Book Club, and I think that was a very good discussion, and Anatomy of the State is short and sweet. Although it's kind of bittersweet because it's talking about how the government is inevitably corrupted, but it does tell you ways to kind of fight it and what it fears. Alrighty, up next, we have Tam Tam, possibly the #1 cheerleader in the entire space. She says, "What's up, fam? Good to see you. Thanks for coming by." After that, we have good friend of the channel, Fast Abdul, says, "Button that like smash." Indeed, good sir. Indeed. And after that, we have one more good texture. Good to see you. I think this is the first time seeing you in a show, so welcome. Hopefully you like it here, and we hope that we provide some good value for you tonight. That's what we got going on. Alrighty. That being said, let's get into it. So, Christian, for the folks at home, people that don't know you, who are you? What do you do?
I've been asking that question for 30 years now. So my name's Christian Heiens. I live in Virginia. I suppose I'm most famous. I don't really like to use that phrase, but I'm most well known for being on Nick Freitas's podcast, Making the Argument with Nick Freitas. Nick has been a very good friend of mine, actually, since I was in high school. He's 15 years older than me, so he's half generation older than me. But we had a mutual friend whose family I went to high school with a child in that family, and he used to be their neighbors back when he was in the military station out in Fort Lewis in Washington State. So it was kind of like a small world type of thing when he moved to small town Virginia. I met him at a birthday party once, and we started talking about history and politics and geography and philosophy and all the type of stuff that I'm really interested in. And one thing led to another. I struck up a good friendship with him my senior year of high school. And when I went off to college, we just started chatting about these type of topics. Actually, Bastiat was one of the first people that he and I connected over. And by the time I was graduating college, I was pressuring him to run for office. He told me no 3 times. Finally, I managed to get him to say yes. He ran for the Virginia General Assembly, the state legislature here in Virginia. He got elected. And so it was like 2 or 3 weeks after I graduated college, I went down to Richmond to go work for him as his chief of staff his first term. He made a couple runs for Congress, for U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, we lost both of those races by razor-thin margins. So I ended up leaving his office, working on the political electoral side rather than the policy side. That got me into electoral politics. And after his loss for Congress in 2020, where we only lost by like 8,000 votes, we started the current thing that we do right now, which is the podcast. The whole reason we wanted to get him into DC was because we wanted him to make the argument. We wanted him to talk about some of these same, policies, these same philosophies that we're going to talk about tonight about, that appear in the law. And we ended up learning that, you don't actually need to be in DC to make the argument, right? You can build a following online without needing to be a congressman. And that's exactly what we've done. And so the podcast that we have now has been a lot larger than anything I ever expected. To give you an idea, the whole reason I'm on the show was because Nick was not a famous person. We didn't have anybody else to be on the show, so it was just me. And now here we are a couple of years later, and we have thousands of people that tune in every single week. And it's kind of crazy how things turn out, but that's who I am. I'm a good friend of Nick's. I'm a generation younger than him, but I've known him for almost half my life now. And we just share similar interests. We both come from a similar background philosophically, even though we've lived different life experiences. And yeah, that's led to where I am today.
By the way, hats off to you guys. I think the YouTube channel is about to cross 1 million subscribers.
We are on the verge. I have a bet with Nick that we'll be able to get to it within the next week. So we'll see who wins that.
Absolutely. Let's see if, we are the measly people here at only 1,000 subscribers, but anything we can do to help, I hope we can.
Well, let me tell you, I enjoy coming on smaller shows personally. And the reason why is because I feel like that they're a little bit more authentic. It's so hard to, once a channel gets, over 100,000 subscribers, it's much harder to have authentic conversations with people. And it's really funny because people watch me, and obviously they come to watch Nick, but they see me as well. And man, when you're like grocery shopping and somebody stops you and they're like, "Hey, you're that guy on the podcast," it's really weird, right? Because you didn't really sign up for this. And so I tend to be a very introverted person, right? But I feel like that, I can return back to that mold when I'm in a smaller channel with people, because it's, it feels like a more tightly knit community when you do that.
Very true. Yeah. I mean, when you were doing all your stuff growing up, did you ever think that you'd be the co-host of a YouTube channel that's the primary source of income?
No, you have to remember, when I started working with Nick, I was like a policy wonk, right? I wanted to work behind the scenes. I didn't really want anybody to follow me. I wanted people to follow what Nick had to say. And I wanted people to follow what Nick had to say because Nick was articulating many of the same things that I believed better than I myself could. And the reason why was because he read books like The Law. If Nick was to tell you 3 philosophers that make up his worldview more than anybody else in terms of politics and economics, he would probably say Thomas Sowell, Frederick Hayek, and Frederic Bastiat. Those would probably be the top 3. So the book that we're going to be discussing tonight is critical to understanding the type of worldview that he comes from when he approaches his podcast.
Nice. I think the other 2 authors you mentioned on there are probably going to be on the short list for books we're going to cover on Book Club very soon. I know that I've been threatening the gang to torture them with Road to Serfdom for a while now. We might actually pull through on that promise.
Yeah, we were just talking about that right before we went live, actually. Yeah, I highly recommend Road to Serfdom. It's a fantastic book.
Yep, that's a classic. And then, I mean, if you if you take any econ class, you're going to unfortunately learn about Keynes, and that's the other half of that story. So either way, that's a good one. All right. With that being said, you ready to get into this?
Definitely.
Cool. Okay, let's start at a top level. We touched on it a little bit, but can you give the sales pitch for why someone should read this book? Like what's the elevator pitch?
You need to read this book because it articulates and then deconstructs socialist thought and why it does not work. Ultimately, that's what this is about. Bastiat explains in about 90 pages or so, depending on the version, the edition. He explains in about 90 pages, which is not that long. You can read it in a day or two, right? He explains about 90 pages why the law has been perverted to a point where it's actually infringing upon justice. It's infringing upon individual liberty. It's infringing upon your natural rights as a human on a scale that quite frankly, people don't fully appreciate. And if you read the law, you can understand how government and how the law has become perverted into destroying the type of things that enable human freedom to flourish.
I like it. That's a good pitch. After reading it, I think that the best way to summarize the book for me is that it's really broken down into 3 sections. So first off, you have the pitch for libertarian values, effectively, pretty much the protection of life, liberty, and property, and then the justification behind it, and then a few examples of how they can be perverted. After that, we get into the second chapter, which is largely talking about examples of history past and how you can see examples of how things work and don't work. And then after that, you get to chapter 3, which I'm sure is a lot of people's favorite section, which is just the full-blown giving the business to the socialists of why all your ideas are stupid and why they don't work. So that's pretty much the synopsis for it. And it does it all in 90 pages, which is, I gotta say, I know this was originally written as a pamphlet, but at the same time, like, this is a very complete book in a, like, half the page count than a lot of other books. And the margins are massive, and it's almost double space for me. So I gotta say, I typically usually go through the audiobook route, but for this one, I actually did with my eyeballs and stayed awake for. So this was a good read, and I like it a lot. Anything I missed there on the summary?
No, I think you nailed it. It's part of the reason that the law, I feel like the law encapsulates some truly eternal principles. Obviously, Bastiat, and we might get into this, right? Bastiat's writing in a time of immense political upheaval. There's multiple revolutions that are going on. There's changes in government. There's new ideas and philosophies that are popping up, many of which are not really good ones. Socialism's really kind of on the rise in this time period. But a lot of the stuff that he writes about, even though he's writing in such a enormous period of European history that in some ways has actually been forgotten today, a lot of the principles that he talks about, again, are just as applicable in 2024 as they are in 1850. And as I said in the introduction, in some ways, actually more so. And so it's very rare that you get a book that's so old and yet so true and so eternal. And I think that's part of the reason. It's not just how short it is, it's how true the words are that he's putting into such few amount of pages.
That's true. It's short, but also a very eloquent synopsis of all the ideas. And by the way, we have someone in the chat who's talked about one of the socialist lies that we're probably going to get to. So, Mrs. Producer, if you don't mind. That's right, good texture. Socialism is legalized theft, right? I would agree. Cool.
Bastiat would call it legalized plunder.
Yep, and we will spend a good chunk of time talking about that one because I think it is a very, very important topic, especially in today's day and age, unfortunately. Cool. So let's talk about some of the historical background. Bastiat wrote in about 1850, I want to say. Correct me if I'm wrong here.
The law was written from 1849 to 1850. He published it less than a year before he died. He unfortunately died around Christmas of the end of that year. He had tuberculosis. He actually hints about it in the law. There's a line where he talks about how he will defend these values that we're going to discuss tonight, with it up until his dying breath. And then he says, which alas is all too inadequate because he was suffering from tuberculosis, which is, it's really a shame because in some ways Bastiat dies at the peak of his political career. He, to give you a little bit more background. So he was born in the early 1800s. He was born actually under the first empire of Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. And his family were relatively like upper middle class. They were involved in business. Some of his family members had actually suffered during the French Revolution, certainly during the Reign of Terror with the Jacobins. And he started entering politics in the 1830s and 40s. And once he entered politics, he started running into, the typical, sophistry that you see within so many members of electoral politics, even today. And this upset somebody like Bastiat, who was well-read, he was well-educated, he knew his philosophy inside and out. And so he started countering some of this stuff. This got him into a process of writing these things that ended up becoming pamphlets. And what happened in 1848, this is actually synonymous with Tocqueville as well, who you might be familiar with. Tocqueville, famously wrote about democracy in America. He did a tour of the United States during this time period. Tocqueville gave this prediction in 1848 about a revolution that was coming. He said he was a member of the French legislature at the time, and he said, we're sitting on a volcano, the wind of revolution blows. And it was about a month later that you had a continental-wide revolution. It was called the Revolutions of 1848. There were many different goals, but they struck France, they struck Germany, Austria, Italy. And in some ways, they were inspired by many of the principles of the failed French Revolution from a couple generations earlier. And the revolutions in 1848 failed spectacularly everywhere except one place, in France. They succeeded in France. They failed in Germany. They failed in the German Confederation. They failed in Austria. They failed in Hungary. They failed in Italy. But they succeeded in France. And what happened at the end of the revolutions in 1848 was a toppling of the July monarchy. It was the last French monarchy under the Orleans dynasty. And it was an ushering in of the French Second Republic. And the French Second Republic kind of failed right from the outset because what they did was they elected a Bonaparte as their president, which went about as well as you could predict. Who would have thought that another Bonaparte would end up making himself emperor just a few years later? And Bastiat is actually elected to the French legislature during this immense political upheaval where the monarchy is overthrown again. And they bring in a Bonaparte to become president. So this is almost like the consulate period where he's like acting like a dictator, but he's not quite yet the emperor. And so it's like history in some ways is repeating itself in France here. But not only is history repeating itself politically, but some of the same principles that are coming out of this second French Revolution, in some ways it's actually the third French Revolution, but we don't need to get into that. Some of the principles that are coming out of this French Revolution in 1848 are actually synonymous with some of the really radical stuff that was coming out of the first French Revolution. The Jacobins and the Mountain and the Herbertists and some of these other movements that are coming out of the French Revolution in some ways are proto-socialist or proto-communist movements. This is long before Marx, of course. But by the time you get to the 1840s and 1850s, Marx is coming onto the scene. And ideas like socialism are starting to become mainstream. And Bastiat is seeing this manifest itself at the same time that he's elected to the legislature. So he's having to combat all sorts of ideas about why we need central planning, why we need government control over the economy, why we need enforced liberty, fraternity and equality. A lot of these ideas that sound classically liberal, that sound libertarian on the face of it, a lot of the same people that are espousing these principles are advocating for, in some ways, tyrannical government-enforced centralized mechanisms to achieve it. And this is antithetical to a lot of what Bastiat believes in, which is what drove him into writing the law in the first place, because he's elected, he's going to Paris, he's serving in the legislature, and he gets there and he sees all of these people want to reshape France in their image. They espouse liberty and fraternity and equality, but they want to impose it on the people by force. And he thinks this is actually a grave mistake.
You brought up one of the points that I actually had in my notes, which is Karl Marx. You mentioned that Karl Marx was really up and coming during the 40s. And I was looking it up. Correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but the Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. Bastiat started writing in 49. The French Revolution is no internet era, which means that information cannot proliferate nearly as quickly as it does instantaneously today. So I wanted to get your take on how much of an influence Karl Marx was in the French Revolution. Was he kind of like a spark for it? Or as you said before, it seems like the whole nation was kind of already on the brink of revolution and it was happening in other countries. So is this a lot of Karl Marx-based stuff, or is this maybe some other influences primarily?
Well, it's a combination of things. So Marx himself is influenced by the French Revolution. Marxists look at the French Revolution through their historical materialist outlook, and they say the French Revolution is a sign that the bourgeois will overthrow the aristocrats and the monarchy, but then this will usher in the era of capitalism, which will eventually be overthrown by the proletariat once they attain class consciousness. So Marx is certainly influenced by the original French Revolution, the one from the 1780s and 90s, right? By the time you get to Marx's own era, though, and you have this revolution in 1848 that, again, it's not just in France, it's in all of Europe, but France is the place where it's the most successful, where they actually do overthrow the government and usher in a second republic. What happens in the Second Republic is quite interesting, because the Republicans are not a unified bloc. They agreed on, yeah, we need to get rid of the Orleanists, but once they get rid of the Orleanists, there's immediately a dispute over, well, what type of republic should we be? And there's one block of Republicans that are what we would call today, the extreme left-wing, progressive, socialist types. And they're heavily influenced by people like Marx, who's writing at the same time. They're advocating for things like a government jobs program. They're advocating for massive welfare programs on a scale that had never existed before. They're advocating for guaranteed work. They're advocating for subsidies. They want centralized control over the economy. They think that this is, and they call themselves liberals. A lot of them aren't even calling themselves communists at the time, because, as you said, these ideas are in their infancy. But Marx is actually inspired by a lot of what's happening here. And so Marx looks at what's happening in France, and then he actually looks at the defeat of the socialist faction. There's actually an uprising in Paris at this time during this revolution where the socialists try to take power. And the more conservative Republicans actually brutally repress them. There's street fighting. It's a bloodbath, basically. And the right wing of the Republican movement ends up defeating the left wing of the Republican movement. And that basically kills off the socialist wing, the politically active revolutionary socialist wing for a generation, until you get the French Commune in 1870. But even though it killed off the violent revolutionary wing of the socialist movement, it didn't necessarily kill off the political philosophy of socialism. And so there wasn't going to be like an uprising in the sense that Marx thought, the proletariat are going to seize power. But you had a lot of these people serving in the legislature that are still espousing these views. And so it's an exchange of ideas back and forth, where Marx is influenced by what's happening in France just as much as the stuff that's happening in France is influenced by some of the ideas that Marx is writing about. And Marx is actually citing Bastiat in some of his works. Marx is extremely critical of Bastiat. There's actually a quote by Marx where he says, he's talking about Bastiat, and he says, Bastiat is the shallowest and therefore the most successful representative of the apologists of vulgar economics. So Marx is obviously not a big fan of Bastiat, but they were contemporaries of one another.
Funny how that works out. But yeah, when I was reading the book, I was trying to figure out if this was a translation thing. And obviously we're not speaking French right now, so can't really figure it out. But the text that I had specifically says communism and refers to a form of communism. So I was trying to figure out if that is specifically referencing Marx and that brand of communism, or if this is more of something that's either a translation or just a colloquialism for the time.
Yeah, in some ways it's a combination of both, because again, Marx Marx, in some ways, doesn't just come up with this idea himself, right? He's drawing upon history. As I said earlier, Marx is heavily influenced by the French Revolution, actually, the original one, the first one. And so Bastiat's referring to that old tradition just as much as he's referring to contemporaries of himself that are advocating the same stuff that Marx is calling for. So it's a combination. There's a lot of overlap there.
Okay, fair enough. All right, that's a good background. Let's get into the material. So the first chapter, I want to start off like foundational. So base level, there's kind of two sections that go hand in hand in my mind. The first off is when Bastiat starts off by saying that life is a gift from God and therefore it has value and must be preserved. And then second part of that is saying that the representations of life are this gift from God manifests themselves as life, liberty, and property. Not the watered down American version that we got, which is the pursuit of happiness, but good old straight life, liberty, and property. So is this, when we look at this, is this really an argument to religion, or is this an argument towards like human rights from like maybe a natural law standpoint? And the kind of classical view that is enshrined in the Constitution and the Declaration, which is that these are negative rights, as in that they're given to you by God. This is not something that someone can give you. You automatically have them.
Personally, I would argue it's actually both. I would argue that it's an appeal to religion and it's an appeal to nature itself. It's an appeal to natural law. In fact, Bastiat actually kind of encapsulates a lot of this when he talks about how it's because life, liberty, and property pre-exist the law that the law was created in the first place. He actually mentions this in the law itself. It's in this same segment where what he's trying to say is that so many people have this kind of flipped around, right? They think that government is the thing that creates these laws, right? You know, government is the thing that creates these rights. No, it's because these things exist that we construct governments in order to protect these things. It's not these things that spring forth from government. It's that government is instituted in order to defend these things that are eternal and exist long before governments are put into place.
For sure. I think this is the first example of a tool that Bastiat's used in his writing, which is the inversion idea, which is that you may think of things as they are on their face, but the reality is that the thing exists, and it's kind of nebulous because it exists only because the opposite does not exist. And in this case, it is not the idea that governments or man can grant these rights or these things that should be protected. It's that they actually existed before any of this was here. So we're going to see this again when we start getting to some of the other concepts. So just as a heads up for the folks at home that read it and might have been a little confused, this is kind of one of the tricks that Bastiat writes about, and it works well in my mind.
Yeah, you see this actually quite a lot in much of what Bastiat writes about, even outside of the law. There's a quote that I'll probably read off later in this live stream that's my all-time favorite quote by Bastiat, and it's actually in another work of his that he wrote. But there's another analogy that I'll briefly bring up just to drive the point home, where he talks about the concept of the negative railroad. And the analogy works something like this. There's people that are advocating for protectionism. And he uses an analogy of like trade between Spain and France. And they're saying, well, we need tariffs in order to, defend the French, market from outside sources, in this case, Spanish imports. And he suggests, well, rather than raising tariffs, why don't you just wreck the railroads that transport the goods between Spain and France? Because then it'll increase the cost of transportation, and therefore it will bring about the tariffs that you're advocating for. And he uses this analogy not because he's actually wanting to wreck the railroads, but because he's wanting to illustrate the absurdity of the argument itself. So it's another example of the inversion in order to make a broader point that otherwise people might not, intuitively think about.
True. Alrighty, so last point on life, liberty, and property is the opposite of these things. I think that Bastiat, from my interpretation of what he's talking about, there's three ways that each of these things can individually be corrupted. Life, obviously, self-defense is the actual preservation of your life, and if someone is trying to infringe on it, they're obviously trying to create death, which is the opposite of it. Liberty is obviously you being a free man, and in this case, the book actually specifically singles out slavery because at the time this was still widely practiced across the world, and they actually give a nod to the United States later on that we're gonna touch on. And then finally, property, which is ownership rights, or the idea that when you mix your blood and sweat with the things, it kind of becomes yours. And anytime you deprive someone of that, that is plunder or theft, which is depriving you of the property. And that's the negative view. What do you think about that take?
I think you're absolutely right that Bastiat is espousing a view of negative rights. In fact, he's highly critical in the law and elsewhere of rights that require the use of force and coercion in order to bring about. And this becomes a central theme. It's probably the central theme of the law itself, which is that you cannot bring about X, Y, and Z, whatever X, Y, and Z is, if you're using force and coercion from the government, from the state, in order to do so, because the only way that the state can deliver X, Y, and Z and replace X, Y, and Z with anything, well, I'm sure we'll have some examples that we can directly point to tonight. But the only way that the state can provide these things is if it infringes upon the life, liberty, or property of the individuals that it's supposed to be defending life, liberty, and property of. And so it's an inherent contradiction of the entire reason that we construct states in the first place, which is why he comes up with the concept of plunder. And this is central to Bastiat's theme about how the law becomes perverted over time.
True. The reason that I'm spending so much time on this one and really trying to hammer it down is because, like you said, these three concepts and the application of the law to protect these three specific things is the entirety of the argument as far as I got out of it. So after we move on from this, we're pretty much going to be talking about how all the different things in the world can possibly violate one of those three things: life, liberty, and property. Alrighty, so after this, we move into these things existed before law and man, therefore law and man are supposed to protect those three things. And then we get to what actually protects them. And that comes to the idea of individual versus group force. There is no group force because at the end of it, it's really just individual forces together. And when you have many individual forces together as a group and a centralized force that is legitimized, that is where you get the government, or as he calls it, the law.
Exactly. So Bastiat actually writes about what is the proper function of law, and he articulates. I'll read off this sentence in particular because it's echoing what you just said. He says, "What is the proper function of law?" And Bastiat goes on to say, "Since no individual acting separately can lawfully use force to destroy the rights of others, does it not logically follow that the same principle also applies to the common force that is nothing more than the organized combination of the individual forces? If this is true, then nothing can be more evident than this. The law is the organization of the natural right of lawful defense. It is the substitution of a common force for individual forces. And this common force is to do only what the individual forces have a natural and lawful right to do, to protect persons, liberties, and properties, to maintain the right of each, and to cause justice to reign over us all."
Good stuff.
It is fantastic stuff. And he actually articulates later on that in some ways it's not even to have justice reign over us all, it's to prevent injustice from reigning over us all. So he again uses that inversion tactic to illustrate how it's not actually to bring about justice. It's about in order to prevent injustice. And when the law becomes perverted, when the law becomes a mechanism for plunder, it actually brings about the very injustice that it's supposed to stop.
For sure. This might be skipping ahead a little bit, but specifically with the negative view of justice and injustice, he's saying you can't really do justice, but injustice can be done. So therefore, you really only have justice in the absence of injustice. And the whole purpose of the law is to prevent injustice. The purpose of the law is not to create justice, but to prevent and punish and oppose injustice.
Exactly. It's to uphold these things that we just talked about earlier, all the natural rights that he thinks long predate the existence of governments or even societies for that matter.
Alrighty, now this is the part where he says that the law is really perverted in two ways. We have, his words, not mine, stupid greed and false philanthropy. It's a very cutting explanation of that. So stupid greed, the notes I have on this one is that people are trying to live and prosper at the expenses of others. And this is where you get into the idea of plunder. There's property and there's plunder. Property is what's yours and plunder is where you are taking what is not yours. And he describes it as this, which is that labor to produce property can be described as pain. And people will resort to plunder when it is easier and more efficient and unpunished. And then inversely, property is inversely pursued when plunder is very harshly punished and more pain is required to plunder than it is to produce.
In some ways, Bastiat is articulating a concept that becomes more properly fleshed out in the future that we refer to as the conquest ethic. And the conquest ethic goes something like this. Imagine that you are a merchant operating in, say, the Middle East during the Middle Ages, right? You're in Baghdad and it's the 1300s. And you make money off of selling goods and services that people are willing to pay with their own coin in order to facilitate. You're not forcing anybody to do anything. It's an exchange where it's mutually beneficial for both parties. But then one day the Mongols show up and you try to negotiate with them, but they're not interested in negotiating. They're going to sack Baghdad and they're going to steal all your stuff. Why? Because they have the numbers to do so. They have the ability to take the city and sack it and burn it to the ground. For most of history, the tragedy of human existence has been that the way that you become wealthy is not by trading, it's not by inventing, it's not by building, it's by seizing, right? This is what the conquest ethic is. It's the idea that you become wealthy by stealing from somebody else by force of arms or by coercion. Now, the advent of capitalism, or the advent of property rights, even long before capitalism, the advent of property rights necessitated the idea that, oh, well, maybe you can become wealthy through mutually beneficial trade rather than me enslaving my neighbor or stealing from my neighbor or pillaging from my neighbor. I can become wealthy by trading with my neighbor. And Bastiat is really defending this principle in the face of a return of the conquest ethic. It's the Mongol style or the Roman style or the Persian or Macedonian style of how to get wealthy. And Bastiat is saying, no. That's the tragedy of most of human history. By the time the 1850s are coming around, we're just getting out of this tragedy. And yet here we have an entire class of people that think, no, this is not just the correct way to get wealthy. It's actually the noble and good way to get wealthy. Well, at least the Mongols didn't have a sense of moral superiority when they sacked Baghdad, right? But here you have an entire class of people that think, no, sacking Baghdad is actually a moral imperative. And Bastiat's trying to explain, no, this is not just a moral imperative, it's self-destructive, and there's no moral good that comes out of it.
I think when it comes to the idea of sacking Baghdad for the moral good, that's where you really get into the other idea which he proposes, which is false philanthropy. It's that you're trying to propose a good cause, and sure, the cause might be good on its face. However, at the same time, using the law for that cause is not the correct way to go about it.
Exactly. There's another line in here that I want to read across because I think it gets across just how, in some ways, funny but also genius Bastiat is. He has a segment in here where he talks about how politicians misinterpret the law, and he says, when a politician views society from the seclusion of his office, he is struck by the spectacle of the inequality that he sees. He deplores the deprivations which are the lot of so many of our brothers, deprivations which appear to be even sadder when constrained with luxury and wealth. Perhaps the politician should ask himself whether this state of affairs has not been caused by by old conquests and looting. That gets back to what I was talking about with the conquest ethic, and by more recent legal plunder. Perhaps he should consider this proposition. Since all persons seek well-being and perfection, would not a condition of justice be sufficient to cause the greatest efforts towards progress and the greatest possible equality that is compatible with individual responsibility? Would not this be in accord with the concept of individual responsibility, which God has willed in order that mankind may have the choice between virtue and vice, and the resulting punishment and reward? But the politician never gives this a thought. His mind turns to organizations, combinations, and arrangements, legal or apparently legal. He attempts to remedy evil by increasing and perpetuating the very thing that caused the evil in the first place, legal plunder. We have seen that justice is a negative concept. Is there even one of these legal positive actions that does not contain the principle of plunder? And so he's getting across that they have it entirely the wrong way around. A politician gets elected. He thinks, I'm going to do things to help people. He goes to Paris. Again, this is 1848, 1850. And he gets there and he's like, there's all this poverty. There's all this misery. There's all this inequality. The way that we're going to solve this is you give power and wealth to me. And me, the politician, I will fix things. I will get things done. I will eliminate all this injustice. And Bastiat's getting across, what are you, made of finer clay than the rest of society? What gives you the expertise to reorder society? In some ways, what this is it's the new socialist man. It's what communists talk about. It's this utopian vision that if you centralize power, if you centralize wealth, and whoever has the ability to actually wield political power, they can remake society in their image, and it will be better for everybody else. And Bastiat's getting across, no, it's this centralization of power and wealth is what creates a lot of this misery and inequality and injustice. And you're only going to be perpetuating the very problem that you say you want to fix.
Absolutely. I mean, that in essence is the difference, the difference between legal plunder and the conquest ethic, like you said, which is that normally without a government authority or force, any kind of use of this similar force would be the barbarians coming in, sacking the village and stealing everything you have. But if the government does it, magically it's okay. Like, you got to cross that bridge at some point. It's like, I think he's really harping home, and the answer is like, look, theft is theft, whether it's you doing it or someone else.
That's why you have given legal plunder. Because what he would call illegal plunder is, again, it's the Baghdad sacking, or it's the Mongol sacking Baghdad, right? Or it's the Roman sacking Carthage, or it's any type of imperialistic war of conquest, right? That's what Bastiat would call illegal plunder. And everybody recognizes that that's wrong when like a foreign army comes in and conquers land and, steals everything and hauls it home. When the Vikings show up and pillage your local monastery, that's nobody thinks that's a good thing other than the Vikings, right? But when you pass a law and you say, we're going to confiscate this wealth, or we're going to centralize this power, or we're going to take away your individual property rights or your individual liberty, or in some cases, your life. Well, how is that any different than the foreign army coming in and sacking and pillaging and looting? One's legal and one's illegal. That's the only difference. That's how the law becomes perverted.
I think there's another point that he makes here, which is that there's a misconception that something that is legal is also moral, and that unfortunately the common man has a tendency to conflate the two. And when you start making things that are immoral legal, people start to believe that these now legal things are also moral, which is part of the reason why I think some people can reason themselves to the end state that kind of got to the French Revolution and the people that are promoting socialism.
Absolutely. And he warns about repeatedly on how perverting the law to a point that you associate legality with morality, even when the legality itself is actually amoral, creates this perverse incentive where over time society actually becomes corrupted because people associate horrible actions with legality itself. This is a reoccurring theme across all of his writings. And you see this within portions of the law itself, where Bastiat's a good example of this is actually some of his dire predictions for the future. So he points to the United States, and you hinted at this earlier. He points to the United States and he says, there's two examples in a country where the law is actually more in line with justice than arguably any other country in the world. He associates the United States as being, in some ways, the best country in 1850, where the law is actually in line with upholding justice and defending against injustice. But there's two exceptions. And he uses, one example is tariffs, and the other example is slavery. And he associates tariffs with it's a violation of property rights. And he uses slavery as it's a violation of individual liberty. And what's interesting is Bastiat, as a French citizen who's never been to the United States, actually makes a prediction in the law in 1850, 10 years before it happens, where he predicts that these two things might one day result in a fracturing of the Union. And I mean, Bastiat was dead on. He nailed it.
It happened within the decade too. That's kind of wild.
It's incredible that again, the foreign observer writing, 2,000 miles away is able to predict a decade before it happens, the American Civil War. And the reason why is because even though he's not an American and he's not extremely well in tune with like the congressional debates or the cultural dynamics of the United States, he's able to see these two examples of the law being perverted to an extreme point in America, in a society where in almost every other respect, the law is not being perverted. But in these two cases, the law is so overly perverted that he's able to predict a civil war a decade before it happens.
That's true. I mean, it's tied a little bit into the founding of the United States, which is that a lot of the founding fathers at the time were writing about how like slavery is a thing that they want to get rid of, but they weren't sure if they had the exact power to do it. I think Bastiat is kind of in a similar scenario where it's like he's not worried about like founding a country per se, but he also does recognize like which way that like liberty and freedom is moving. And he says a quote here that slavery and tariffs are the sorrowful legal inheritance of the old world. And that's the line where it's like, okay, I think it's one of those things where it's like speaking like that really indicates that you kind of get the meta, so to speak, and understand where the political winds are shifting. Unfortunately, he was living in an area where the political winds were shifting in the wrong direction. But on the global scale, I think just based off some of the readings, it's like you're able to tell that.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this gets back into this broader point about how Bastiat is realizing that in some ways there's a tragedy that's unfolding here, because the old world is gone and the new world is in the process of being born. But at the same time that it's being born, he's realizing that this new world is not the type of classically liberal world that he's advocating for. And in some ways, it's becoming the socialistic world that eventually manifests itself, I would argue, in the 20th century in particular, with the rise of the communist bloc post-World War II, but also the rise of, this overtly socialistic, bureaucratic, managerial class-driven, quasi-technocratic, micromanaging of everything that you see even in the West, right? And so somebody like Bastiat, if he was plopped here today, I think he would look around and be like, yeah, in some ways I predicted this would happen. Because at the same time that the old traditions are being thrown aside, right? The old regimes of the French monarchy, right? 1848, the French monarchy is gone, permanently gone. At the same time that this is being overthrown, and Bastiat would welcome this. The thing that's replacing it is not a reign of justice, or at least a negation of injustice. Instead, it's a moralistic revivaling of the same type of principles that he viewed with absolute horror from centuries ago. And so, it's almost like a tragedy that humanity has to just constantly repeat the same type of injustices over and over again. And there's actually quotes of him where he's talking about how, it's insane that everybody has to suffer something, in some ways, Bastiat is realizing that history, unfortunately, is constantly having to repeat itself, and we're having to constantly relearn the same lesson over and over again.
Unfortunate. This is a good point. You when we were talking before doing the show and talking about notes and stuff, you mentioned that Bastiat has predictions. I will admit I was unable to go back through and find them, but now that you mentioned that one, it makes sense. So I want to ask, what are some of the other predictions that are in the law?
So one of actually, let me pull up my notes here, because there's a couple of examples here that I want to get across. One of them is the distinction between government and society. And in some ways, this is an issue that was not really prominent before the mid 19th century, but it becomes a much greater issue until finally you get to today, where in some ways we're living part of the problem of modernity is this issue that Bastiat's bringing up. So there's this segment where he talks about the distinction between government and society. And he says, socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude we object to it being done at all. We disapprove of state education. Then the socialists say we are opposed to any education. We object to a state religion. Then the socialists say we want no religion at all. We object to a state-enforced equality. Then they say we are against equality, and so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we do not want the state to raise grain. And so this distinction between government and society becomes a bigger and bigger issue until finally, I mean, look at where we are today, right? You have somebody that votes against the Save the Puppies Act, and then they're accused of wanting to kill puppies. And even if their defense is, it's not the government's place to be saving the puppies. I shouldn't be taking your money from you. And by the way, the Save the Puppies Act, for some reason, involves, subsidizing the missile program of Pakistan, right? Like there's so many examples of this today where we have conflated society and the state. And Bastiat is realizing that this is a huge issue that previously hadn't necessarily been in place, because in some ways there were these tight-knit communities where before the era that Bastiat is writing about, nobody really mistakes society and government, right? And so the injustice that existed is that government was not by, for, or with the people, right? You know, government was entrenched in many cases absolute monarchies. It was entrenched in hereditary nobility. But even though there was a perversion of the law in the sense that people's individual liberty was being violated in the sense that they couldn't govern themselves, there was no distinction. There was no issue in terms of this misdiagnosis of society and government being synonymous. A good example of this is even under the absolute monarchy of the Ancien regime, the same one that was overthrown in the original French Revolution, you did not see central planning on the scale that you saw after the 1850s, after the revolutions of 1848, and in the case of Europe, certainly after the Marxists take over in Russia 100 years later in the Soviet Union. And so this is an example where, yeah, you had a perversion of the law in the sense that you had like absolute monarchies. And this is something that Bastiat is railing against. This is what places him on the left politically. But he disagrees with the left in the sense that, yeah, they want to overthrow the monarchy, but they want to overthrow the monarchy and then put in place central planners. And he's pointing out, no, you're making this terrible distinction between government and society that previously had not been made. And unfortunately, this battle increasingly gets lost over time until finally you get to today where, I mean, no matter the issue at all, right? People lose elections because they vote against things. And then it's like, oh, well, you're against X, Y, and Z. No, I'm not against education because I don't want a federal Department of Education, but people can lose elections off of that today.
That's true. I like the section that you referenced for this one, but in my mind, I read this as two different things, which you did touch on. The first is the conflation of this society and the government. And then the second one is the socialist fallacy, which is that if you don't want the government to do something, you don't want this thing to exist at all. Obviously, that's not the case, because you can very easily in the same breath also say, this is not for the government, but I do think it'd be good if this is done by, like, I don't know, private individuals or like church groups or local organizations. Like, that's the place for that. And you can absolutely explain it in the same breath. So that is the socialist fallacy of this. But then conversely, when we were covering anatomy of the state last week, they cover this exact topic, and it's the idea of people wrongly conflate society and the state, except through this like weird notion when people say that we are the government. And the implication of that book is saying that when you say things like we are the government, as in like society and the people are the government, what you're saying is that any ill of the government is almost self-inflicted, which is that if the government sentences you to death, if you are the government, then you're just committing suicide. If someone is robbing you, like the government, you are not being robbed, you're merely donating. It's this kind of thing.
Yeah, and this is how you get situations where people pride themselves on being good people. Well, because I pay taxes. Well, that just...
Did you pay extra? Did you pay extra taxes? Answer me that. Show me the stub. I want to see it.
It's even worse when you get people say, well, see, I advocate for forcing you to pay higher taxes, so therefore I'm a good person. By the way, you asked for a second prediction. There's one more that I think is very eerie. It's directly in the law too. It's not even in any of his other writings. And it's the chapter or it's the segment where he talks about the victims of lawful plunder. And this segment is probably my single favorite segment in this entire book.
This is the next major point I wanted to get to. Is this the if you are the subject of legal plunder, you have two options, and then out of this arises the weird prisoner's dilemma, where you have three viable options for plunder.
Yes, and there's a really haunting sort of prediction in here that gets back to the broader thing that we were just talking about a minute ago. So
all right, let's hit it.
I've got to read this off because this is probably some of the best work that Bastiat ever put in. It's only 2 paragraphs. It's this segment titled Victims of Lawful Plunder. And he says, men naturally rebel against the injustice of which they are victims. Thus, when plunder is organized by law for the profit of those who make the law, all the plundered classes try somehow to enter by peaceful or revolutionary means into the making of laws. According to their degree of enlightenment, these plundered classes may propose one of 2 entirely different purposes when they attempt to obtain political power. Either they may wish to stop lawful plunder, or they may wish to share in it. Woe to the nation when the latter purpose prevails among the mass victims of lawful plunder, when they in turn seize the power to make laws. Until that happens, the few practice lawful plunder upon the many, a common practice where the right to participate in the making of law is limited to a few persons. But then participation in the making of law becomes universal. And then men seek to balance their conflicting interests by universal plunder. Instead of rooting out the injustices found in society, they make these injustices general. As soon as the plundered classes gain political power, they establish a system of reprisals against other classes. They do not abolish legal plunder. This objective would demand more enlightenment than they possess. Instead, they emulate their evil predecessors by participating in this legal plunder, even though it is against their own interests. It is as if it were necessary, before a reign of justice appears, for everyone to suffer a cruel retribution, some for their evilness and some for their lack of understanding.
That was one of my favorite parts, for sure. And I think it's one of the most important parts. I think that game theory is a fun buzzword of the common day, but this is the actual game theory of the incorrect ways to use the law. So out of that passage that you just read, there's two things that we can come to, in my opinion. The first is that you, when you are the victim of plunder, you have two options. You can either do nothing and continue to be plundered, or try to eradicate the plundering, or you just join in yourself because this is the new normal. And that is not good. And that kind of gets us to that triumvirate of the prisoner's dilemma when it comes to plunder, which is that we have the three options. You have a few plunder the many, everyone plunders everyone, or everyone realizes that no one should plunder anybody. So you got those three options: some of the many, everyone on everyone, or nobody on nobody.
And this is why I said that it's almost like a haunting prediction, right? Because Bastiat recognized the injustices that prompted the First French Revolution. He also recognized the injustices that prompted the 1848 revolutions. He recognized that when you have an entire class of people that are disenfranchised, again, he says they will seek to get into the action of making the laws. This is why you get the French Revolution. This is why you get the 1848 revolutions. But the problem that he in some ways is predicting here and living through at the time that he's writing this, serving in the French Assembly at the same time that the monarchy's finally overthrown and you get the Second French Republic, is that Bastiat is realizing that, oh no, the people that are overthrowing the Orleanists, or, you know, a generation before, 2 generations before him, the people that overthrew the Bourbons before him, that chopped Louis's head off, right? They didn't come in and then say, and now a reign of justice will rule over us all. No, instead it's going to be, now it's our turn to plunder, right? You know, these monarchists, these, you know, nobles or whoever, these people that were running the show before, they were plundering us. Now it's our turn to plunder. And he's realizing, oh no, this is a disaster, because you've somehow made things even worse than they were before. Because before it was at least the few, right? The elites, the nobility, the hereditary monarchs, at least they were it was a 1% of the population were plundering everybody else. Now you're creating a system where whoever gets a majority of the vote ends up getting to plunder everybody else. And now you're creating a perverse incentive where everybody feels like they have to get into lawmaking so that way they can get in on the plunder. Nobody's trying to get into lawmaking to stop the plunder. Nobody's even talking about that third option. And it's that third option is the only one that allows for justice to reign. The other two options are a form of injustice. And unfortunately, as Bastiat's saying, it's as if everybody has to suffer some type of injustice, some for their cruelty or their evilness, right? And some simply for their lack of ignorance. And so in some ways, he's predicting that it's going to somehow get worse before it gets better. And I would argue that when you look at the history of the West, when you look at the history of Europe and even the United States since 1850, in some ways, I think Bastiat has absolutely been right. We've overthrown the rule of the few plundering the many, and we've adopted the many plundering the many. And we're increasingly just moving towards everybody plundering everybody. And that's a state of basically a type of anarchy that I don't think libertarians would like. It's almost like an anarcho-tyranny. There's no justice involved there at all.
I would, if you can take it a step further, in my opinion, which is that if you get to the point of everyone plundering everyone, you are effectively completely eliminating the idea of property rights, which is that nothing belongs to you and anyone can come take anything at any time, and you can go take anything of anyone else's at any time as well. Therefore, no one owns anything. You just merely have it in your possession for this current moment.
Exactly. And this is why I said that in some ways Bastiat is almost like a prophet to me. And
dark prophet.
And it's a tragedy that he's a prophet, because he's predicting either directly or indirectly many of the problems that we're dealing with today. This is why I said it earlier in this live stream, that in some ways what Bastiat is writing about in 1850 is more apparent today than it is at the time of when he's even writing these words.
True. Mrs. Producer, can we bring up Jay's comment? This is another one of our team members, Agent Jay Schroth. He has a good one here. He says, if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. The sentiment of going from the few plundering the many and then going to everyone plunders everyone, I think the attitude that it takes to get there is it's not good, which is, oh, you thought the plunder was bad? Well, now we're going to do it so much better and so much harder than you could ever imagine.
Yeah.
It's really saying like, oh, you thought those guys were bad guys? I'll show you a real bad guy.
You know what it is? And I said earlier at the very start of this, that there's another couple of lines that Bastiat wrote that I wanted to get across. And I think this is probably the best time to do it, because another one of his works that he wrote simultaneously with the law, it was around the same time, but it's a much shorter work. It's called Justice and Fraternity. And he wrote it about a year or half a year before he started writing the law. In some ways, Justice and Fraternity is actually like the thing that motivates him to write a much longer work. And he has this segment in here where he talks about some of the things that the socialists of his time are demanding. And it gets into the whole, everybody's going to eventually end up pillaging everybody else because you've perverted the entire purpose of the law. You've turned us away from a system where the few are plundering the many, which I am opposed to, just like you are. But instead of us returning to a system or embracing a system where nobody plunders anybody, we're now going to just embrace a system where whoever can wield power, whoever has the most numbers, everybody will just eventually end up plundering everybody else. And he says here, and this is just beautiful language here. He says, the socialists declare that the state owes subsistence, well-being, and education to all its citizens, that it should be generous, charitable, involved in everything, devoted to everybody, that it should intervene directly to relieve all suffering, satisfy and anticipate all wants, furnish capital to all enterprises, enlightenment to all minds, balm for all wounds, asylum for all the unfortunate, and even aid to the point of shedding French blood for all oppressed people on the face of the earth. Who would not like to see all these benefits flow forth from the law as if from an inexhaustible source? But is it possible? Where does the state draw these resources that it's urged to dispense by way of benefits to individuals? Is it not from the individuals themselves? How then can these resources be increased by passing through the hands of a parasitic and voracious intermediary? Finally, we shall see the entire people transformed into petitioners. Landed property, agriculture, industry, commerce, shipping, industrial companies, all will bestir themselves to claim favors from the state. All public treasury will be literally pillaged. Everyone will have good reasons to prove that legal fraternity should be interpreted in this sense. Let me have the benefits and let others pay the costs. Everyone's efforts will be directed towards snatching a scrap of fraternal privilege from the legislature. The suffering classes, although having the greatest claim, will not always have the greatest success.
Wow, that was really good. I mean, the man might be a philosopher, but I think he's actually a physicist on that one, because that's like laws of thermodynamics right there. It's like, look, you can claim these resources, but you're parasitic in the nature, so you're never going to get what you take anyways. And then additionally, this is actually kind of a missing link that I thought was missing from the law, which is that he talks about enforced fraternity. And when I was reading it at first, it was kind of like this nebulous concept of like, is this maybe like freedom of association, something like that, or like claiming a heritage or something? But if the idea is that fraternity is claiming to be a part of group of people that like receive the benefits of something, then yeah, this very closely ties to that idea of plunder for sure.
Absolutely. In fact, he points out that the very phrase of the French Republic, right? You know, liberté, égalité, fraternité. He points out that you actually cannot have these things if you're using the state in order to enforce them. You're actually going to destroy fraternity if you try to make it state imposed. You're actually going to destroy liberty if you try to make it state imposed. And this, again, this gets into the distinction between society and government, right? When you try to enforce fraternity, you're actually destroying fraternity. Fraternity comes about organically. It comes about naturally. It comes about when you allow people to be free to form bonds. This is why we have freedom of association. That's where you get true fraternity from. You don't get true fraternity by legislating fraternity. Do you legislate families together? Do you legislate, men and women coming together and raising children? No. You end up getting these things that we associate with fraternity when you allow people to be free to pursue happiness, pursue liberty, defend property rights in absence of government force and coercion, not through government force and coercion. But there's another thing in that quote that I read off that in some ways is it's a real tragedy, because what he's getting across is that you're going to create a system where everybody feels like they have to be involved in politics now, because the only way for you to get something is if you're politically active. We ask ourselves,
boy, does that sound familiar.
Have you ever wondered, why does it seem like everything is now politicized? It's because the law has become perverted. And this gets back into the whole historical analogy, right? There was an injustice that existed before the French Revolution. You could not enter into the making of laws unless you were born into a special class of people, unless you were the king or the nobility. That is a perversion of the law, because you were denying somebody the ability to enter into the making of laws to defend these negative principles, these negative rights that we hold dear. Once you overthrow that system and you replace it with a system where we're now going to pervert the law and turn it into a mechanism through which everybody will be able to pillage everybody else, rather than overthrowing that system and replacing it with one where everybody can enter into the making of a process where we will defend these principles and not violate these principles. That's what Bastiat's advocating for. That's that third option that nobody takes, unfortunately. Instead, he's almost predicting that everything will become politicized over time, because we've made it possible for you to enter into politics, which is fantastic, but we've perverted politics itself. We perverted the law itself into something it never should have been. And so now everybody over time will realize, I have to get in on the legal plunder because somebody else will if I don't. And that it's a huge tragedy. This is the thing that it's the number one thing that he's warning about in the law, because what will eventually happen is everything that we think is important to the maintenance of a society, the maintenance of a government or a civilization, will end up falling apart, because there won't be fraternity, because people will view each other as enemies, because they want to enter into the making of laws. That way they can pillage one another. You can't have fraternity in that case. And so all of these principles that Bastiat is trying to defend, and that he also thinks other people on the left, other socialists, also want to defend, he's predicting that the very principles that they're trying to uphold, they themselves will end up deconstructing and destroying them, because they don't understand what the law is supposed to be.
Like it I don't know, much more than that. That was the final link for me, which is the idea of, trying to see how plunder overrides property, but then enforced fraternity is really the overriding of liberty. So yes, that is the less clear one out of those two, in my personal opinion. Alrighty, with that being said, I think we got the last major. So as far as like Bastiat building up his theory before deconstructing the socialists, I think there's one final thing that I wanted to get to, which was identifying legal plunder. And this is where he makes a step away from just pure theft, but actually to explaining the system of three different versions of socialism, which he describes as protectionism, socialism, and communism. And protectionism is the one that I think this ties on, which is that when it comes to identifying legal plunder, you can identify legal plunder. Shoot, where did it go? Through when something is taken from one person and given to another that doesn't deserve the said thing to have. And then the last one is the law, whenever the law benefits one at the expense of another, because an action or an ability is legal for one but illegal for the other. That is where I think you get the protectionism aspect.
Yes, this is why he's a big critic of protectionism. This gets back into some of his analogies that he was using. He talks about the United States. In some of his other works, he talks about things like the negative railroad. Bastiat actually warns that if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. And part of the reason why is because it is definitely a line. And part of the reason why is because he thinks that if you impose tariffs, that's the same thing as it's another example of the perversion of the law, because what you're doing is you're doing something that if an individual did it, it would be illegal. Think about all the things the government does today that if an individual did it, it would be illegal. Think about the Federal Reserve for like that. This is another example, right? Like think about the debasement of the currency that you get through things like quantitative easing. Bastiat, he's writing before the Austrian school pops up, of course, but Bastiat would be a firm supporter of the Austrian school if he was alive today, because he would look at things like quantitative easing. He would look at things like tariffs. He would look at things like the income tax. He would look at things like subsidies. And, you know, there's even some quasi social things. He would look at things like DEI programs. He would look at treatment. He would look at affirmative action. He would look at all these things as perversions of the law, because what they're doing is that they're either taking from another individual and giving to another, or they're denying an individual the ability to actually execute their liberty or their property rights, or they're doing things that an individual would never have the right to do to another individual. And so any of those mechanisms are how you can identify when plunder is taking place. They're also how you can broadly identify when the law is being perverted. And tariffs are just one of many examples of this. He gives actually many examples in the law itself of instances of legal plunder taking place. But tariffs are definitely one of the prominent ones.
He has quite the list on that. I wrote them down, and we can cover that in just 1 second. But when it comes to the idea of what is legal for one is illegal for another, you're preaching to the choir here, brother. Like, even I did this is using bad math, but to explain the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve, even if, big if here, they hit their 2% inflation rate, which they pretty much never do, but even if they did, that means that from a value perspective, after 25 years of you just holding money in savings for some important thing in the future, you've effectively lost half of what you had. Not because of half of it's gone, but because of the value of it has literally decreased in half, because if you multiply 2 by 25, again, this is very bad math at this one, but it proves the point, which is that the idea of fiat currency is one of the examples of this, which is that you can do this thing which no one else can do. No one else can make money, just the federal government. They've been very strict about this one. And it's examples like this. This is how you get away from like the pure taxation is theft, or just like literally ripping money from one person and giving to another. It's that you can do actions that are legal plunder, not in direct like theft, but in actual regulation and in practice.
It absolutely. You know, it's interesting. The Constitution of our country, the United States, lists counterfeiting as a federal offense. And yet the federal government, the Federal Reserve, is the one that's engaged in the most amount of counterfeiting of any entity for all of human history.
What is it? Projectionism? Is they accuse you of what they're already doing?
Exactly. And so, like, I mean, part of the reason that I even wanted to come on this show in the first place was because I thought that there would be some alignment there, because I know that you're into crypto. I'm not as well versed in it, but the thing that got me into it was actually because I can't stand the fiat system. Ever since I read Bastiat, I looked at the Federal Reserve and I was like, oh, this is plunder. This is legalized plunder. This is legalized theft, because we view money as a representation of wealth. It's a representation of my efforts. It's a representation of either ideas, of either hard work, of how much value people are willing to give to me in exchange for goods or services that I produce to them. I'm not compelling anybody to hire me. I'm not compelling anybody to purchase any product that I'm making. I'm not the government, right? I don't have guys with machine guns that can go to your door. I'm not the Mongol sacking Baghdad. I'm the merchant. And yet the state is using a legal mechanism, a monopoly on their own currency, and they're debasing that currency in large part in order to facilitate deficit spending and debt monetization. They're using that mechanism in order to basically steal my hard work, in order to steal my wealth. This is exactly what Bastiat's warning about. And this gets back into this eternal thing that we're going to probably bring up repeatedly, how Bastiat's work is more relevant today than it ever has been, probably at any point in time since he first wrote it.
For sure. Reading this book for me, it very much is an exploration of the ideals and the philosophical base. But the one thing that I really don't see out of this book is the practical implementation on today's battlefield that is government and politics, which is that we can espouse all these beautiful ideas and say that this is how the world ought to be. But we have to also operate on the world that is, and unfortunately, how to navigate the world that is right now, which is that if you tried to propose these ideas, you'd absolutely be laughed at in today's day and age, which is that, oh, you want to go back to that immediately? I mean, granted, the answer to that is that by doing so, you're eliminating 95% of the federal government, which, I mean, I'm not opposed to.
No, not at all. I'd love to go back to the law. I'd love to go back to even 1850s, French-sized government, even with all, because Bastiat talks about all the problems that exist in his own time within the government that in fact, he even references in the law. There's a couple examples of within the book that are contemporary to when he's writing about. But even those in some ways pale in comparison to the problems that we have today. You're right that there's not, it requires a bit of a leap to get to examples of issues today when you read the law, but I think it's a very easy leap to take. When you read the law, one of the things that I enjoy about it so much is that it is relatively easy for you to draw conclusions by looking at the world around us today. And it gets back to your point about how, we have an ideal world, especially if you're a libertarian or you're a conservative. The dark secret is I probably don't identify as a libertarian anymore. In fact, we actually have a podcast that's going to come out about this relatively soon where I extrapolate about this. I definitely still identify as an Austrian school supporter, absolutely through and through. I identify as a Bastiat supporter through and through. But, we look at the world that we have today, and it is true that we do not get to deal with, our idea of the perfect. We have to deal with the world the way that it is, not the way that we wish that it were. But I would say when you read the law, there's many examples that you can instantly draw, especially once you get to the chapters where he talks about what is plunder, how can you identify plunder, how does plunder manifest itself, right? You can very easily look at policies, look at politics, look at political parties, look at programs, and you can identify examples of plunder. And unfortunately, as you said, I think 95% of the government is engaged in one form of legal plunder or another right now. It might even be more than 95% at this point.
True. Again, this is where I struggle with, or not struggle, but I wrestle with the idea of what is philosophically good, and then on a practical level, how do we actually effectuate a good practices in real life? And again, I think I identify with a lot of what you guys talk about over on Making the Argument, which is libertarian ideas are great. The Libertarian Party is an absolute circus. And it's like the ideals are good, but we haven't been able to implement them. And at the same time, if you keep trying to implement ideals that are unable to fight for themselves, especially like, I know I'm probably ripping right off from your guys' show, but when you have one group of people that wants to be left alone and one group of people that wants to rule the other, guess what? The people that want to rule are going to start encroaching and encroaching. So it's that thing where it's like, we can try to be ideologically pure in our ideas, but at the same time, if the ideological purity doesn't get you anywhere, then unfortunately your ideas and you yourselves and the people perpetuating them are going to go the way of the dodo bird. And you're going to cease to be if you can't advocate and actually defend your ideas and promote them.
I totally agree. And, we didn't talk about this on the podcast that we filmed yesterday that will be going out in a few days, but we do need to talk about this in the future. We might end up doing a podcast specifically about this, like a way out of the wilderness, so to speak, because I would submit to you that today, if you read the law, if you find it compelling, if you agree with a lot of the principles, maybe even not all of them, but if you agree with most of the principles that Bastiat is getting across in the law or any of his other works, understanding the different types of plunder, I think, is essential in order to figure out what we need to do next. Because as you said earlier, he talks about different types of plunder, right? There's the few plunder the many, there's the many, or in an extreme case, the all plunder the all. And then there's nobody plunders anybody. It's ultimately going to be one of those three things. I think what we need to be doing is applying Bastiat's own worldview, doing that twist, that negation, right? That usually people don't approach it. Like Bastiat will take a concept and he'll turn it on its face and then articulate it in a way that nobody has really thought of before. And then they read it and they're like, oh man, that's so compelling. right? Like the best example is at the start, right? Where Bastiat says, no, it's because life, liberty, and property predate government. The government is instituted in order to defend these things. They don't spring forth from government. That's that negation, right? Well, I think that the way that we go forward is we do the negation of the plundering, in the sense that our goal should not be, or obviously we should support the ideal of nobody plundering anybody, right? If you hold any type of libertarian value whatsoever, you would support nobody should be plundering anybody. But we also know, to your point about how libertarian philosophy makes perfect sense, but ultimately, if you're in a battle between the side that wants to be left alone and the side that wants to win, we've seen from history, we're living through it right now, the side that wants to win will always defeat the side that simply wants to be left alone. So I think that the way that you win, or at least the way that you not lose, to kind of do that twist again, is what we should be fighting for. We should uphold the ideal of nobody should plunder anybody. But what we should be fighting for is stopping everybody plundering everybody else. We should be stopping the many plunder the many. That's what we should be fighting against. We should be doing a negation of what is currently happening. And unfortunately, I think we're pointing to the ideal and we're trying to fight for the ideal, and we're losing because all that we're coming up with is simply, I just want to be left alone. But again, we're like the merchants in Baghdad trying to negotiate with the Mongols. They don't care that you just want to be left alone. They have the force. They have the numbers. They will plunder you. They will unlawfully plunder you. In our world today, we're not having to deal with a Mongol horde sacking Baghdad. What we're having to deal with is politicians getting elected, promising to plunder, promising to loot the republic, and they're getting elected doing so. And then we're coming to the table with, well, we don't think anybody should plunder anybody. Well, that's great. We've made the argument, and then we lose. We lose the argument, and then we lose the election, and then they go ahead and they plunder the republic anyway. They loot the republic anyway. What we should be doing is fighting to stop the plunder, rather than trying to push our own utopian ideal. That pushing a utopian ideal, I don't think gets the job done. I think the ideal works as something that you aspire to and that you measure things against, but don't make the good, the enemy of the perfect, so to speak. We should be fighting against the many plundering the many, rather than just trying to push nobody plundering anybody else, even if we don't want anybody to plunder anybody else.
Very true. I think that when it comes to the political space, one of the reasons why I invited you out here is because I think that a lot of the libertarian idea struggles that you guys are having on the political stage, I'm also seeing in the crypto space, which is that, I mean, I don't want to give away too much here, but I would love at some point to maybe have you back and talk with one of our mentors, RG3, who's trying to really put together kind of not a movement, but really put together a group of people supporting projects. And it's the idea I wanted to talk with you about is, how do you lead in a decentralized space where it is a very atomistic and individualized area, which is that how do you get the people together to rally around a cause when the cause is to rally around yourself? It's this paradoxical idea we got to be able to figure out to be successful.
In some ways, to use Bastiat as another analogy, because anytime that I can tie in Bastiat to something like this, I'm definitely going to. Bastiat is talking about fraternity, right? And he talks about how, when you pervert the law and you use it for plunder, you're actually going to be undermining fraternity. What you're in some ways saying is, how do we build fraternity, right? How do we build, fraternity through a decentralized mechanism? And I don't think it's actually impossible, because it's similar to, like, how do we build society? Well, there's two ways you can try to build society. You can do it from a centralized effort. You could go full central planning, full USSR style totalitarianism, full Big Brother, or you can allow people to be free, and you can let this is a concept that comes up a lot within Austrian economics, where you can have order, but it can be spontaneous order. It doesn't need to be centrally planned order. It doesn't need to be totalitarian imposed order. It can still be order. It doesn't need to be chaos, but order can emerge spontaneously. It can emerge organically. You don't need to legislate it. You don't need to, iron fist it. If you allow people to be free, it can happen. There's another book that I'm actually getting through right now called The Ruling Class. And I'll probably tweet about this soon, because I want to let people know that I'm starting to read this, because it's a good book that I think most people should read. It's written by an Italian philosopher named Mosca, and he's writing in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And Mosca is actually a liberal, but he thinks that most political revolutions actually are led by what he calls the ruling class. Now, what he identifies as a ruling class is not a totalitarian. It's not like the nobility or the ruling, like they can in a society, right? But a ruling class doesn't have to be like aristocrats or the communist Politburo or anything like that. A ruling class could be like the founding fathers, or a ruling class. They're the intellectual vanguard, so to speak, of the American Revolution. Now, that's not a tyrannical vanguard like in the sense of Lenin's Bolshevik Russia, but it's still a ruling class. And Mosca's a firm defender of classical liberalism, but he's not necessarily a firm defender of some of these things that Bastiat's warning about how perverting the law into a mechanism where it's just everybody, plundering everybody else. And Mosca is also politically active around the same time that Mussolini pops up in Italy. And Mosca is a huge opponent of Mussolini. He's actually a member of the Italian Senate. He's appointed by the king. And so in some ways, he has political immunity from Mussolini's control over the government. And he's like giving speeches all the time in his like late years, in his 70s and 80s and stuff like that. He's giving speeches all the time where he's complaining, he's railing against some of the actions of Mussolini. And he's saying like, you're tearing apart the social fabric of Italy because you're trying to impose it through state, totalitarian mechanisms. But it's interesting that part of the reason that he was allowed to stay in office as long as he did was because the ruling class was misinterpreted by Mussolini as, oh, this is legitimizing us because we're going to be the ruling class. Mussolini is missing Mosca's point. Mosca's point is that a ruling class can direct a society, but that doesn't mean it'll be good or evil. It just means it will happen. It's almost like it's fire. Fire can heat your house, but it can also burn your house down. And so I think that the way forward is ultimately the right as a broader mechanism, which includes anybody from conservatives to libertarians, anybody that's opposed to legalized plunder, anybody that's opposed to communism or Marxism or socialism. I think the right needs to establish their own ruling class. And I don't mean that in a totalitarian sense. I don't mean that in an aristocratic sense or a hereditary sense. I mean that in an intellectual sense of similar to what we had with the founding fathers. We need a class of people on the right that have read the philosophy, that understand the economics, that understand the Austrian school, that understand Bastiat's arguments and can articulate them and lead people that might not have read these things, might not be subject matter experts in these things, but they understand that Marxism's not good, or they understand that socialism's not good. And it's through that mechanism that we can actually end up moving the ball. Because I think that history is filled with examples of revolutions succeeding when you have a ruling class that is able to direct people in a positive direction. And when you have it in a philosophy that's rooted in things like the Austrian school, or rooted in Bastiat's philosophy and the law, rather than a philosophy of like Marxism or communism, it can be a very positive thing. Because remember, ruling classes can impose evil, but they can also negate evil. It just depends on what philosophy they're pushing. We saw this in Russia 100 years ago, right? There was a vanguard that overthrew the Russian government and established an evil totalitarian dictatorship. But we also saw this in America, where you had a ruling class that ushered in what I think is, and what Bastiat thinks is, arguably the greatest country that's ever existed, that has been as close as possible to a proper application of the law as we've ever seen, which is the early American government.
I don't know if I can say any better than that. I mean, like, I still stand by the idea that the United States is still hands down the best country on earth because of the values that we espouse, not just because we're like the economic superpower house, the military powerhouse of the entire world, and that you could argue that the U.S. effectively creates a unipolar world with the United States kind of at the helm. But the values are worth defending. And I know this might be me complaining about the marketing and the sounding of it, but when you say ruling class, I think that a lot of people in today's day and age are going to have a vehement opposition just on the sound of that. But in my mind, when you say ruling class, what my mind automatically transfers to isn't that just leadership?
And that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is.
No one has authority over anyone. There's no the royals and all the. I know a friend. She's like very into what's the royalty dating show thing right now. I can't remember it, but it's a show. It's focusing about like the upper crust of society and how the women are trying to find husbands and they all date within each other and they're not part of the hoi polloi, God forbid. They all have to be in the upper class. Like, that doesn't exist in America. And I think that's a good thing, personally. So if you are not delineated by pretty much economics or bloodline or your distance to the crown, so to speak, then you pretty much have to lead through making good arguments or providing some benefit to people in some way as part of a group. And I'm not saying do so as part of legal plunder, but find a way to create value for others so that they're willing to exchange with you or be able to provide a positive vision for the future that people are willing to get behind, even though they themselves are the individuals that still want to make this thing happen.
Absolutely.
That's what I think of.
Absolutely. And to your point about marketing, obviously, when you say ruling class, people think of, oh, so you want a dictator or so you want nobility. No, Mosca's point when he wrote that book is that all societies have a ruling class, but the way that they manifest themselves can be different. Some could be, historically, most ruling classes were you were born into the right family, or you were the king, or you were the nobility. In China, the ruling class is the Communist Party, right? That's not a hereditary thing, but it's still a totalitarian thing. In the Soviet Union, it was the Politburo. But in the early United States, the ruling class was the Founding Fathers. And so we today, yes, we would recoil from the term, and I totally understand why. But it's exactly what you're getting at. It's what it really is it's leadership is what it is. It's statesmen is what it is. It's what Jefferson is talking about in a lot of his letters to other founding fathers about how this first generation of leaders. It's also what Benjamin Franklin is talking about in the notes on the Constitutional Convention, where he talks about how our first leader, our first president, our first executive will be a good one. And what happens after that? Well, we don't know, right? It's the whole a republic if you can keep it. Well,
sorry, John Adams.
Yeah. I mean, so like what we need is we need leadership is what we need. And it needs to be a form of leadership that is built around meritocracy, right? It should be a form of leadership that anybody can enter into, not whether or not you're born into the right family or you have the right amount of money. It's whether or not you have the right amount of ideas and you're skillful enough in order to do the job. That's what we need right now. And unfortunately, we don't have that. What we have right now is we have a ruling entity that is interested in perpetuating its own existence in looting the republic. And it's mostly a managerial bureaucracy. That's what we have at the moment. We don't have we don't have servant leaders, right? What we have right now is a nameless, faceless blob in Washington, D.C. that is leeching off of the American taxpayer. And I think the way forward on the right is infusing some of these works that you guys have either talked about before or maybe will in the future, and realizing that we need to articulate more leaders within the right, because I don't think we quite have that. We have a lot of people that know what they're against. We don't necessarily know a lot of people. We don't have a deep talent pool right now of people that know what they're for and are able to guide us through the wilderness and get us out of this madness right now. But it's not that I don't think it's impossible. I think it can happen. It happened once before in our country's history. It could happen again.
True. I mean, the argument from the other side to me should be like, I should be happy that I actually am ruled by the best and the brightest from the investor class, which is like the greatest investor in the history of the planet of Earth, Nancy Pelosi. So I should be happy that she's at the helm of this, because I'm trying to be an investor. She's the best of us. What am I mad about?
Well, I'm certainly happy that her trades are public, so we get to copy them, right? But
look, I'm not going to say that buying NVIDIA was the highest IQ play. I would almost argue it was kind of obvious, just given everything else going on. But at the same time, you gotta tip the hat where you tip it. If you buy options, you're putting some skin in the game. I'll say that much. So, alrighty. I wanted to cover a few final things. That was an excellent segment, but we got to get back to Bastiat and make sure that we finish the book for the good people at home. So the last few things, I'll tie this back into what we were talking about. We get into some of the socialist fallacies. And when we were talking about how do we actually convince people of what we want, I think that it's very easy to fall into one of the traps that Bastiat actually talks about here, which is, he said, shoot, I just lost it. I had highlighted. Okay, here we go. He says that, socialists think that if people are left to their own devices, they will ruin themselves by arriving at atheism instead of religion, at ignorance instead of knowledge, and at poverty instead of production and exchange. The fallacy here is that the socialists are very much a proponent of freedom until the people with the freedom start doing the thing they don't want them to do. and then they're suddenly very against it.
You know, it's interesting that he's talking about, socialists think that people will turn into atheists. He's writing in the 1850s, but today socialism is more aligned with atheism than it was in the 1850s. So in some ways, it's interesting that there's been this inversion. And I think it's in part because communism is itself a very materialistic, atheistic philosophy. I mean, Marx talks about historical materialism, for example. But no, he's totally right. But what's interesting is that you actually get the fraying of the bonds of society. This is actually something that Nick and I just talked about recently. You get the frayings of the bonds of society once you turn politics into this winner-take-all absolutist system where you have to get in on the making of laws in order to pillage other people, because if you lose, somebody else will get in and they will pillage you. Once that happens, there's no fraternity. There's no society, there's no government, there's no culture, there's no social cohesion whatsoever. We view each other as atomized individuals in the void that could potentially be enemies. We end up distrusting one another because we know, well, these people might get in government and hurt me. And so, I mean, it ties into the problem that we have today. There's so many problems that exist today. And one of them is, in some cases, like, the fraying of the bonds of society. We're becoming individualistic in the wrong way, not in the libertarian way where it's like you are an individual that have God-given rights, natural given rights to pursue happiness according to your definition, not the government's definition. You are an individual that has property rights that nobody can infringe upon. You are an individual with individual liberty. Nobody can take these things away from you. You should be able to pursue life, liberty, and property to the best of your talents and abilities. That's a positive application of individualism. That's the application of individualism that libertarians and classical liberals and supporters of the Austrian school support. There's a negative application of individualism that nobody should support. And this is you're an atom in the void, separated from everybody else, that have no ties to anybody else. And I don't mean coercive ties, right? I don't mean the state-imposed fraternity. I mean the organic type of fraternity, the type of fraternity that you get positively manifesting itself when you allow people to be free, when you allow people to engage in freedom of association. That's falling apart. And part of the reason it's falling apart is because everything has become politicized. Everybody is now viewing each other as homo economicus, as political actors that might one day hurt them. And so we're distrustful of one another. Trust in institutions is collapsing. Social cohesion is collapsing. The birth rate is collapsing. Marriage rates are plummeting. There's so many social problems out there. And what's interesting is so many of these social problems can be traced back to the fact that we have perverted politics and perverted the law into something that it never should have been. The reason that these things are happening, the reason that the society is fraying, is because the socialists have gotten their way.
That's true. I mean, you also hit on one of the other fallacies there, which is the idea that if you just view people as atomistic and things that can be changed, and you mentioned the finer clay argument earlier, which is that if you view people as these things that can be changed and fixed to be better men or better versions of humans, you're ignoring the fundamental issue, the fundamental idea that the humans themselves have the inherent value because they're human. Not that they can be better, but because they are what they are and they have that value to begin with.
Absolutely. Again, it gets back to his original point that, it's because life, liberty, and property existed that we construct governments to defend these things. These things don't come from government. And when we forget that, we end up constructing legal systems that, ironically enough, actually tear down life, liberty, and property.
True. Alrighty. We are coming up to the end of the stream, so I'm going to try to get to final points, and then before we can move on to the extrapolation. So one of the things that I didn't really see a whole lot of in this book is positive applications of government, or Bastiat overtly saying what is a just use of the law. I think I want to get your take on how you think Bastiat fits in with the idea of federalism, because I think that he does talk about the idea that there's a certain point where you can do things in a group that is cohesive and has an identity that is not using force. But then at the same time, if you eventually keep ascending that ladder of federalism, you are eventually going to arrive at the federal government. And that is where you get to the law. So the quote that I have for this is that, quote, please understand that I do not dispute their right to invent social combinations, to advertise them, to advocate them, and to try them upon themselves at their own expense and risk. But I do dispute their right to impose these plans upon us law by force and to compel us to pay for them with taxes.
Absolutely. So Bastiat is getting to something that Nick and I actually talk quite a lot about, which is intentional communities. So again, it gets into the difference between society and government. Bastiat would not at all be against an intentional community. A good example of this is actually the crypto community, right? And so these are people that are willingly coming together because they have a shared purpose. In this sense, they have a shared interest in alternative currencies to combat, to combat the current fiat system that we have right now, the Keynesian model that rules over us all. This is an example of something that Bastiat would endorse. Bastiat would also not be against such a community coming up with a sense of guidelines or outlines that govern the actions of the community. So if you said, like an example would be Nick and I's community that we have in our circle group. We have a list of things where we say, this is what we believe in. If you want to join it, please understand this is what we're advocating for. And if you don't want to join it, you don't have to join it. It's fine. We create these communities organically because we have interests that we want to promote. And if you join this community, obviously there's going to be rules. Obviously there's going to be structure. Obviously there's going to be outlines on how we're going to operate and engage ourselves. But you're not compelled to join the community. This gets into the whole improper use of force, right? Bastiat is not against fraternity. Bastiat's not against, equality. Bastiat's not against, obviously he's not against liberty, right? What he's against is forced fraternity. He wants fraternity. He wants society. He wants these social bonds. He wants social cohesion. What he does not want is state-mandated social cohesion. He does not want social planning. And so he would endorse things like intentional communities. He would endorse things like the crypto community. He would endorse things like homeschooling. He would endorse things like homesteading. And he would even endorse things like coming up with rules and regulations to govern those communities. What
he definitely would. He did say that public school is legal plunder, so.
Yes, absolutely. So he would certainly support homeschooling. And I think public schooling is legal plunder. But he draws the line where you use force, where you say you must be a part of this community and we're going to enforce our values upon you. That's when he would draw a line and say, no, you've perverted the law. And so you can create a country should exist in order to defend basic things like a monetary system or national defense. A country should not exist in order to enforce fraternity. Now, if you wanted to create, the interesting thing is actually where you get, this is almost where you get like a Hoppian take on libertarianism, right? Because Hoppians would say, and in some ways I identify as one, like Hoppians would say, no, you could take an intentional community and turn it into a government. And as long as you have free exit, right? As long as it's no force, it's almost like Singapore. You have certain libertarians that actually love Singapore. And you have other libertarians that hate Singapore because they view some of the social laws of Singapore and say, well, I don't like that. They criminalize spitting gum on the streets. And, I don't like that. But then other libertarians look at the free market aspects of Singapore and they say, well, I support that. Singapore says, well, you can come here. You're not forced to stay in Singapore. Singapore is a free city state in the sense that you can move to Singapore and be a part of the community that is Singapore. And so a Hoppian type libertarian would look at something like that and say an intentional community should be something like that, where it's like, yeah, there might not be, it might not be an anarcho system where you have absolute freedom to do anything that you want, but you have free exit. And as long as you have free exit, then at that point, Bastiat would endorse a system like that and say, good, that's not forced fraternity because you're not compelling somebody to be a part of this community. You're saying, this is our community. This is what we believe in. These are the values that we're going to uphold. And if you don't want to be a part of this community, we're not going to compel you to be a part of it and furnish taxes for you to be a part of it. You're welcome to leave whenever you want. Nobody's going to force you to pay.
For sure. The ability to exit freely, I think, is the key distinction there. All right. So Bastiat would be pretty okay with federalism and very okay with localism, it sounds like.
Yes.
Now, I would like to pose to you a question that was posed by a man much smarter than I. So, reading from Hamilton, this is the bad Hamilton, by the way, in Federalist 30. He's talking about how if the federal government doesn't have the ability to tax, or I don't know, maybe do a little plundering, then bad things are going to happen. So here we go. Quote, from a deficiency in this particular, one of two evils must ensue. Either the people must be subjugated to continual plunder as a substitute for a more eligible mode of supplying the public wants, aka the government wants, or the government must seek into a fatal atrophy and, in a short course of time, perish. Now, look, I know a lot of people see this as a negative thing, but don't get me too excited about the government dying. But at the same time, he is posing a good question, which is that there clearly is a reason to have governments. Life, liberty, and property is what Bastiat argues.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anything outside of like those three kind of concepts that is okay for a federal style government to use taxes for? Like what would Bastiat say is the purpose of the federal government?
Bastiat would say the purpose of the federal government is to enshrine and defend life, liberty, and property. And so he would say things like Bastiat probably would not be against taxes to fund an army or a navy or an air force to defend the country and defend the life, liberty, and property of the citizens of the country. So he would look at that as a legitimate example of taxation in order to facilitate an armed defense of the nation. He would probably also look at a legitimate form of taxation to maintain a court system in order to uphold property rights, right? In order to uphold contract law, which is absolutely essential to property rights. You can't have property rights function if you don't have contract law being able to be enforced by a neutral third-party arbiter between two competing forces. So he probably would be in defense of taxation to maintain that. He probably would be in favor of taxation to maintain like a police force, again, in order to preserve property rights. But you have to understand that, and this gets into that whole inversion thing, his default is always going to be no, right? His default, and this is the inversion of the socialist, because the socialist default is always yes, and you need to explain to them why it should be no. Bastiat's default is always no, and you need to have a very good reason for me to confiscate somebody's wealth in order to give it to you.
To frame it properly, the question that you're asking is specifically about the government. Again, we covered the socialist fallacy, which is just because you say no doesn't mean you don't want the thing to exist, but no, the government should not do this thing.
And this gets into, some really interesting debates about the nature of libertarianism and especially anarcho-capitalism. Nick always likes to talk about, and this is a mild critique of libertarianism that Nick has, and I have as well, which is that if you corner an anarcho-capitalist enough and you explain to them how they're going to defend life, liberty, and property, inevitably they will construct a government. Right? Because they will say, well, we'll get together and form a contract, and then there'll be an organization, and we'll do and so it's like, oh, so you're going to create a government. Again, I think that's correct, but I think this is where the whole free exit thing comes from, right? And so I personally, I think the ideal society is one where you have, almost like a world of 10,000 little city-states. Not that we have that, unfortunately, but, a world of multiple different types of governments where you have a marketplace of ideals, where it's like each government is appealing to people to move to its territory in order to facilitate the perfect type of, or as close to, obviously there will be no perfect thing this side of heaven, right? But like, as close to that ideal form of justice as possible. This is why free exit's so important, right? Because I do think that, and the only way that you can have a truly anarcho-capitalist type society is ultimately you create another type of government. You can call it an intentional community, right? But you have another type of government that might be bound by contract. We can call it a constitution. They might have a system of rules and regulations to govern itself. You might call those laws. And that might have a system of facilitating funds in order to make sure that all these things function. You might call those things taxes. But I think that the only way that you can have that work within a libertarian mindset is you need to have free exit. Now, if you do all those things, this gets back into the original point. I am more concerned about fighting against the all plundering the all, or the many plundering the all, than I am trying to get a mechanism where there will be no plunder of anything, period, the end. Because ultimately, the cynicalist in me thinks that you ultimately can't get a system where there will never be any plundering whatsoever. And if you want a proof of this, I mean, crime happens, right? And that's an example of plunder. You will always have some form of plunder that's some form of injustice. I'm more interested in negating the all plundering the all than I am trying to construct a utopia, because I don't think you can ever get a utopia. So whatever gets me closer to preventing the all plundering the all, the stuff that Bastiat is warning about in the law, that's what I'm going to support. That's what I'm going to push towards. I'm going to be a little bit realistic in that.
That's fair. Before the show, I was trying to find if legal plunder is actually talked about in the Federalist Papers, and I couldn't find anything. Federalist 30 is about as close as you can get to them explicitly talking about taxes on a federal standpoint and like what it's for. And I mean, Hamilton in this one is arguing why there's a necessity for it. But you had a great point just right before this, which is that the question that Bastiat answers and that the socialists in the time also answer is that should the government be doing this? And the answers are yes and no. But I think that one of the good ways of articulating why a default yes is bad actually came when I was looking for it in the lesser known one, the Anti-Federalist Papers. So I'm going to read an excerpt real quick. This is from Brutus number 6. I know this is the lesser known of the two, but here we go. In this one, they're talking about trying to argue against the creation of a strong federal government. It says, but it is said by some of the advocates of that federal system, quote, that the idea Congress can levy taxes at pleasure is false, and the suggestion wholly unsupported, that the preamble to the Constitution is declaratory of the purposes of the Union and the assumption of any power not necessary to establish justice, etc., and to provide for the common defense, etc. Your very open-ended questions there. Continuing. These things will be unconstitutional. Besides, in the very clause which gives the power levying duties and taxes, the purposes to which the money shall be appropriated and specified vis-a-vis to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and welfare, end quote. I would ask those who reason thus to define what ideas are included in the terms, to provide for the common defense and general welfare. Are these terms definite, and will they be understood in the same manner, and to apply to the same cases by everyone? No, no one will pretend that they will. It will be the matter of opinion what tends to the general welfare, and the Congress will be the only judges in the matter. To provide for the general welfare is an abstract proposition which mankind differ in explanation of as much as they do on any political or moral proposition that can be proposed.
I've got to say it. The Anti-Federalists' history has utterly vindicated them. Utterly vindicated them. Brutus is spot on here with his critique of the general welfare clause and some of these other, other phrases that appear in the Constitution, because you're absolutely right that there will never, and this is perfectly tied into what Bastiat is warning about in the law too. You'll always have another group that will say, well, we should be using force for this. We should be using confiscating people's wealth for this. There will always be those type of people. And that gets back into my criticism of how the side that wants to be left alone will always lose to the side that wants to win. And the Anti-Federalists were right, but they lost the debate.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, to summarize that, though, it really is just the principle of you give an inch, they take a mile, which is the exact reasoning why I think Bastiat argues so heavily for strong guardrails and defined singular purpose for the federal government. In fact, 3 of them to be exact, no more or less: life, liberty, and property. And I understand, because I think that I could even see it in the French Revolution movement there, which is it's just the general and ever-expanding expansion of whatever they want to do with the power. It's you have found the sword of infinite possibilities, and you're focusing on the infinite possibilities part and forgetting it's still a sword.
Yes, absolutely. That kind of gets me back to that thing that you read off of that quote of mine that tweet of mine that I put out about the nature.
Oh, we can pull that up.
This is something that I've learned myself from more than a dozen years of working in electoral politics. This
is producer, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there it is. Too many people on the right believe politics is something that it simply isn't. Politics is not the art of the compromise or the art of the possible. It's not about finding common ground, nor is it about blind loyalty to a party like it's a sports team. Politics is the adjudication of power. It is the mechanism by which a society determines who rules whom. Karl von Clausewitz once famously argued that warfare is a continuation of politics by other means. The reverse is just as true. Warfare is the violent adjudication of power, while politics is the peaceful adjudication of power. But no matter how the process is settled, power has been and always will be adjudicated. There is no compromise or common ground on this question. It's a zero-sum game. Some people will rule and others will be ruled. It's only after the adjudication of power is settled that you can determine ways to achieve the possible. By running away from this fact and pretending that politics is something that it isn't, the right has too often abandoned the fight before it has even begun. This gets back to the stuff I was saying earlier about the whole ruling class thing. We can call it leadership instead in the American tradition, because that's what we want. We don't want dictators. We don't want Caesar. We don't want nobility of the robe or nobility of the sword or nobility of the blood. We want leaders. But at the end of the day, there will be leaders. And I mean, even in an anarcho-capitalist system, there will be leaders within that community. And so what politics is it's not about compromise. And I think that any libertarian would agree with that. Look at any time there's a compromise in DC, we need to reach for our wallets whenever that happens. It's not about compromise. It's not about the art of the possible. It's not about coexistence. It's not about sports teams, because ideals are eternal and parties come and go. Politics is about power. Politics is about determining power. Politics is the peaceful determination of power. Warfare is the violent determination of power. And if we want to minimize and prevent the type of all plundering the all that Bastiat is warning about in the law, we need to understand what politics is. We need to understand how power manifests itself. And we need to learn how to wield power, not to impose our vision of the world through a perversion of the law, but rather to defend our vision of the world that we know allows for the spontaneous manifestation of things like fraternity to exist, like society to exist, like liberty and property and life to exist. Once we learn how to wield power to defend that which we love, but again, not just to say I want to be left alone, but to aggressively defend that which we love. Because again, there's that distinction there. Until we get to that point, and until we have leaders that are able to actually make that argument and fight for it effectively, I think we're going to continue suffering under a system where the many plunder the many, or the all plunder the all.
Yeah, I think this is entirely correct. I think the reason I wanted to bring up your tweet on this one is because it's very fun to sit here for 2 hours and talk about the pie in the sky of law and the principles and the beauty of it and whatnot. But your tweet really reminded me of, like, this is where the rubber meets the road. You have to be able to blend the values and the virtues with the actual situation on the ground and be able to navigate it. Because if you don't, you're not rooted to the ground and you're not operating on the world that is. So understand politics for what it is, especially at the point where we're at right now. I know we Cass in the comments earlier mentioned, like, do you think that the law as it stands right now is legal plunder? I mean, I would argue that largely yes, but at the same time, if we are in that position, that means that we are either at one of two spots. We are at the few plunder the many, or we're approaching the point of everyone plunders everyone. And neither of those are good, but at the same time, you got to understand that people are wielding power against other people. So, sorry. Apologies, I think I just went robot for a second. Yeah, the point of bringing this stuff up and talking about it is that you got to be able to construct the philosophy and then also understand how to apply it in your daily life. Whether it's me on YouTube talking about why I think Gary Gensler is the worst head of the SEC, or why you on a local level can say, no, I don't want to vote more tax dollars to school boards effectively, actually. And then they look at you and say, you hate education? And you have to look at them and be like, no, I just think that you suck at it.
Yes. So, I mean, and that's how we get a type of ruling class that's more in line with the American tradition rather than the Marxist or old school European tradition. Because once you read the philosophy and you understand it, but then you also understand how politics works, and you're able to blend the philosophy with the realpolitik, the hard, truth of where we are right now, and the fact that, quite frankly, the hour is late, my friend. Right? Once you blend those two things together and you understand the theory, you understand the philosophy, but you also understand the reality of where we are, the situation of where we are in the hour that we're in, and you understand how politics works, then we will be in a position where we can wield power in order to defend the things that Bastiat is talking about that need defense, because otherwise they will be trampled upon. And once we get to that point, we can finally move beyond simply asking if the roles were reversed or wondering if how are we going to defend ourselves from the side that wants to win because we just want to be left alone? No, we need to win. And we need to define what winning looks like. Winning looks like things like abolishing the fiat currency system, right? Winning looks like abolishing the bureaucracy and the managerial class and abolishing so many of these things that are examples of the law being perverted. That's what winning looks like. It's not about preserving the scraps of individual liberty that we have left. It's about advancing and defeating an ideology that is, quite frankly, dissolving all of the things that made America such a phenomenal country to begin with. It's about advancing a vision, not just trying to play defense.
Very true. The way to actually do that is multiple additional podcasts on top of this. I personally think that one of those podcasts is devoted to getting rid of Citizens United, but that's just a personal take. And then, I mean, outside of that, it's a lot of, like we talked about earlier, how do you lead in the decentralized space? How do you not fall into the fallacy of the socialists, which is, I want to give them freedom until they use it for the things that I don't want them to use it for. It's that kind of stuff. Alrighty, brother, we're coming up on the 2-hour mark, so I want to give you the opportunity to have one final topic or idea that you want to toss around, and while you think of that real quick, I'm going to hit the chats, because they've been stacking up the entire time, and we have some people that want to say hello and have some thoughts. So first off, Mrs. Producer, if we can pull up the super chat from our very good friend, Farmer Brown. He is one of the book club members as well, and he gave us $10 just to say F the law. Yeah, I hope he's talking about the actual, not this book, because Farmer J did also go on to say that this is a very good read in his opinion. He's wanted to say thank you to Christian for the recommendation. Alrighty, up first we got Cassie says this is an awesome history lesson. Christian is super smart. I would agree. That's why we invite the historians on. They know the things. And then Cassie's question from earlier, in your opinion, is our current government enforcing perverted laws at this point in time? How does this affect the common man's life? I mean, do you enjoy paying 30% in taxes? Answer me that. And then up next, we got Centurion 54X, or as we like to call him around here, 54 Cent. Saying, what's up, friends? Good to see you, brother. Always happy to have you. Agent J talking about some of the fallacies we were talking about earlier, the classic straw man of, you don't want the government to do this thing? Oh, you must really hate that thing. Was it you want men to starve because you don't want the government to grow wheat? Was that the...
That's what it was. That's what he said.
True. Alrighty, up next we got Paul Sachs saying, yo, Zenith, manning the helm. Good to see you, bro. Good to see you as well, my man. We have a doctor. He's been nicknamed the Tooth Slayer, but this is Dr. Crypto Sloth, a dental specialist at this point. And then last but not least, we have someone who had me on her show earlier this week, and we had a fantastic conversation, by the way. That is Crypto Stylist. She is a lawyer out in Asia trying to fight the good fight out there, and then also catch all our streams in the morning time, because that's when she gets it over there. She says, whoa, this is a stream for smart people. I would agree. Again, that's why we bring the historians on. They're good
flatter
me. Hey, I mean, it is what it is. I really believe it. Like, I'm very happy that you did come on, because I remember I always listen to Making the Argument, and I'm like, these guys, it feels like we're cut from the same cloth on this one. It's similar values, approaching similar issues, maybe focused in different areas, but at the same time, it's right up the alley. And me in particular, as a former military officer, I understand everything where Nick comes from and talks about all his points. And I'm like, yes, these are very, very well constructed. And then I hear you talk and I'm like, that's the sentiment that I can identify with. That is where it's at. So I know he calls you black pill, but I think you're spot on, brother. Alrighty. Russ, final one here, says great conversation. Alrighty. Christian, floor is yours, my man. Is there any last topic you want to cover, or is there any summary and synopsis you want to give that we have not already done so?
Yeah, if you've read the law, the next thing you got to read is anything from Hayek, particularly The Road to Serfdom. Highly recommend
done.
And yeah, other than that, just thanks for having me on. This was a phenomenal discussion. The last thing I'll say is I've been through a bit of like an existential crisis philosophically over the last few years, because I used to be a hardcore libertarian and I still hold true to many of the values. But again, I feel like it hasn't been working. It's similar to what you said about how, like the Libertarian Party doesn't, every win they have is a win for the left, and every loss they have is a loss for the right. And I think there's a reason for that. And so I've been on this existential crisis. But what's interesting is my position on things like property rights and monetary policy and currency, none of that has changed. My position on things like Bastiat or Hayek or the Austrian school, none of that has changed. But the way in which I think we actually defeat everything that's coming out of leftism nowadays, that has changed a little bit. So I think I have a bit of a nuanced take on some of this stuff, but I really appreciate everything you've said. And I've loved the last 2 hours. It's been phenomenal.
This has been an absolute blast. And I mean, yeah, I'm right there with you. The perpetual question that I keep asking is, I want to make sure that I'm intellectually consistent and honest, and that I'm making principled arguments. But I also see that there's a lot of people that spend a lot of time doing that. And we've been reading a lot of books on the book club, and there's kind of just this like weird theme amongst a lot of like self-help books where the authors also make jabs at people that read books constantly. Call it sort of a mental masturbation per se, because it's like you just keep reading, you're never doing. So want to make sure we're not just reading and talking, we're actually doing. And that also entails you got to have some wins at some point. You can't compromise the values, but if you're not winning, what are you doing?
Exactly.
True. Alrighty. So good, sir. Where can the people find you? What's the best way to watch your stuff and get in contact with you?
All right. So obviously the best way to like watch our stuff is Making the Argument with Nick Freitas. You can find that on YouTube. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts. We've got a big YouTube channel. Nick has a big YouTube channel. I do not have a YouTube channel. Although that might change in the future. We'll see. But Nick's YouTube channel's right about to cross 1 million followers. I'm on practically every podcast. I try to make it on every single one. We record 2 times a week. We go out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you'd like to just follow stuff that I put out, I'm pretty active on Twitter. You can follow my Twitter, which is just my name. It's Christian Heiens. Weird way to spell Heiens. It's 3 vowels in a row, Heiens. My PFP is really funny. It's an Austro-Hungarian chibi, which is a joke that actually goes back to my days of getting my graduate degree. I wrote my thesis on the Austro-Hungarian Navy, which, believe it or not, they had a Navy. Very, very niche topic, which is what they look for in grad school. So it was a joke that turned into a permanent thing because it's Twitter and you want to build a brand that's, I don't know, kind of quirky and unique. So I just kept it there. But yeah, I've put out quite a lot of stuff about, economics, political philosophy and stuff like that on Twitter. So if you want to follow me there, feel free to do so. But I definitely highly recommend the podcast because I think Nick makes even better points than myself, certainly, because he has more experience and it's his show, but I'm just glad to be on.
You say that, but at the same time, help me out here. It's the dialectic, the synthesis.
The Hegelian dialectic.
Hegelian dialectic. There it is. That's you and Nick, man. It's the one and the other and coming together.
Of it, because Hegelian dialectics can be a very negative thing. We actually talk about that quite a lot on the show. But no, I really appreciate it.
True. I will say your Twitter is a very good follow, although I do have to give you some flack here, though, because you retweeted military support saying, "What is this weapon?" And you replied with, "That is a gun." Good sir, that is the M1 Garand, and I have gotten my thumb stuck in that thing so many times. Anybody that's done drill knows exactly what I'm talking about. But yeah, the profile picture is funny. I did want to ask you about that, so I'm glad we got an answer on it. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, please follow Christian Heiens and show him some love for coming on and hanging out with us. We hope that we provided you value, and I hope that we provided him value, because he just spent 2 hours with us talking about 1850s French philosophers. So much appreciated, my man. I know a lot of people would rather be doing different things on a Friday night, but for everybody around here, this is about as good as it gets. True. Excellent. Alrighty, Mrs. Producer, get that trigger finger redder, and Christian, hang out in the green room with us for a bit. We do want to say one more time from the DGen Roundtable, we know that time is your most valuable asset, and every time you spend it with us, we want to thank you for it. So until we see you on Sunday, where we talk about the multitude of hours of congressional testimony I was forced to watch this week, I hope everyone out there continues to DGen responsibly.